Hello everyone. Well, we're excited that you're taking part in the Pillar Preaching Lab, and this is a new experiment for us, so we don't quite know how it's going to go, but we wanted to take a few minutes and just start at the beginning of your homework assignments by having a little discussion between Colby and I about just about preaching and some things that are our opinions and thoughts after having preached for a few years. So we're gonna kind of ping back and forth with some questions that we thought of for one another. So Colby, why don't you start off by just telling us how you begin to prepare for a preaching assignment?
Yeah, so probably the bulk of my time, if I had to think about it, is I'm just trying to get to the bottom of what the text is about. Like I spend a lot of time not only being able to understand some things I can say about it, but I start with one question. I learned it way back when I was doing my biblical studies degree in our first inductive Bible study class, and it was just the question, what is the one thing the whole thing is saying?
Right.
So you get a passage, and I want to try to understand what's at the heart of this. It may touch on a lot of different things,
right,
but there's something that unifies it. There's an idea there to be in the middle, and so I spend a lot of time when I'm beginning just in my head trying to work out what is this one thing, and so I test things. It might come up with, like this week, getting ready to preach on Philippians 1 through 11, and I'm trying to think, is it gospel partnership or finding joy in gospel partnership? Can that be the unifying idea? And then do the rest of the ideas kind of fall into place and explain how to do that? And so, that can take, that takes some research. You got to really understand the passage. And so, at the beginning of preparing to preach, to me, we want to make sure that the passage we're using, that we're saying what it says. And so digging into the middle of that and getting it down to something I can do that. And then not just knowing that idea, but being able to express it with some simplicity and clarity so that it can be a main theme. People walk away, this is what the sermon was about.
So you're pretty much always going to be discovering that main point, and then that's going to be the main point of your talk or your sermon?
Yeah. And even as we pick series, you try to imagine what a series is going to be about. We just finished a series, Cursed, on sin. And I had ideas at the beginning of what some concepts I wanted to communicate, but what was more interesting are the things I learned along the way.
For sure.
The sermon on Cain and Abel, and just the idea of sin as a predator, and it's God who is speaking that. He's telling us that insight. Well, I never intended to preach a sermon with that as a central idea, but it was such a powerful idea when I was studying it and realized that's the center of that story.
Yeah.
And so we want to submit to the text. I only feel confident when I get up there if I'm saying what people can obviously see in the text when I'm done explaining it.
Yeah.
So
good. Okay.
So that's my starting point. I think it'd be interesting to have people hear from you a little bit about what your sermon notes look like. Like what does that look like? What do you go into preaching, or anytime you're speaking, what do you want to go into that situation with?
This is an interesting subject to me because as a preacher, you look at other people's sermon notes, and people do this so differently. It's amazing. Just everything from one guy that I know just studying and then just walking up there and sort of spewing out what has been building up in his mind over the course of weeks, and then all the way to probably what is the other extreme, which would be what I do, which is just a real pretty formal manuscript. Basically, my notes look like paragraph form, version of exactly what I say on Sunday mornings. And the reason that I do that is because every time I try to veer away from that and gain a little bit more freedom, I really wish I weren't so tied to say exactly there. I find that my content is just not as good. I think some people, their minds are wired up in a way where they can just remember things better and maybe go off the cuff better, but I kept, every time I've tried to veer away from that in order to engage the audience better, my content has suffered because of it. So I find that the better sermons that I preach are usually the ones that I think through every word that I'm going to say, and I, in essence, just kind of read.
Yeah, that's kind of a tag onto that question is, how do you utilize those notes in that? Because I've seen yours, and it's definitely manuscript sort of form, But you generally, it doesn't feel like you're
Like I'm
reading
reading,
that.
exactly,
So
yeah.
how do you
Yeah.
go ahead and use those, even though you could literally just read, like I could preach your sermons
Yeah,
on
right.
Sunday mornings and generally
Yeah.
do it.
The way that works is if I am done early enough that I get a chance to read over it a lot, I become versed in it.
Right.
And, it's a lot easier to sort of memorize or close to memorize something that you wrote yourself.
Yeah.
Because the phrases you use are natural, they're phrases that are natural to you. I have some sort of go-to words and descriptions that I always use. And so phrasing, comes naturally. It's not like I have to look at every word, or I can start a sentence and pretty much know how I'd finish that sentence. And so, I think for the most part, if I can finish early enough that I have time to really read over it, I would say, probably 15 times or something like that, where I'm just kind of reading straight through from top to bottom, the whole thing. And then the one thing I do for sure is when I get to stories, I never read the stories. Although I write them out word for word, I never read stories. Because stories come a little more naturally to me, and I know the story. It's not like I'm trying to remember something someone else told me. It usually is something.
Not a technical explanation.
No, it's usually something that happened to me. So that's usually like if you were to be, in a place where I was preaching, when I get to an illustration, where I get to a story, it's almost like, okay, now I'm going to say something.
Right.
And it's almost like the tone of the room changes a little bit. Everybody kind of perks up and pays attention a little bit more. And so I've found that I try to build those reprieves into, if I think, I'm going to go into a long kind of technical passage or section where I'm going to give a lot of detailed information. Maybe I'm talking about the original text or something like that. Or I'm going to a bunch of different verses in a bunch of different places. I'm going to try to put some kind of illustration or story in there that gives the audience a break.
Sort of like a scene change.
A scene change, yeah. And that's good, because you can feel when the audience is drifting off, and it's good to get them back,
Yeah, you want to do your sort of technical work in chunks.
Yeah.
That's helpful.
All right, Colby. What parts of preparing for a sermon come natural to you, and what parts do you really have to work at, or even preaching a sermon? What parts are intuitive and natural, and what parts are hard work?
Yeah, I think the reading and exhausting myself in the subject of the passage comes natural. Like I love to read, I love to think about those. Sometimes I wish I had more time to do it, but that sort of absorption process where I'm learning everything I can about the passage, and for me, maybe it's a learned skill now, but being able to kind of see what are the important things I need to figure out, like that part comes natural. But I think for a lot of people when they're starting out, they have to look for that, learn some of those questions that are going on, like which things are going to be hard for my audience to believe, and just a set of things that really come natural at this point to me. And just that studying absorption part comes natural. For me, it's that what doesn't come natural is simplicity of communication. Yeah. It's the hardest thing that I have to work at. I feel like, it's like I've had to slug out sort of improvements in that area. I can remember one time you, in sermon review, you said something like, it started off as something that felt like a compliment. It was like, you're so smart, man. Smart, and you are so accurate. Yeah. Everything you say it exactly the way it means, but sometimes it's just too, then it was like too complex.
I remember that conversation. I think I said I'd prefer 80% accuracy and 100% clarity.
Yeah, and for those of you who are like, oh, that's anathema, like there's a sense in what you're really saying is simplicity matters in communication, and so in many ways you can. I'm learning, and honestly, since that conversation, that was a bit of a watershed for me, surprisingly, which is a case for critiquing sermons in of itself. Sure. Because ever since then, I agreed with you immediately. It's something I've always noticed about myself. I think I've really tried to give myself to the task of learning simplicity and getting better at that.
And I think probably the converse is true. Like there's some you're particularly academically minded. You're a reader. You can take a complex thought and understand it clearly, quickly. Yeah. There are a lot in your audience that can't do that, and I'm kind of just the opposite of that. I like really simple ideas and and something gets too complex at all, it loses me. I just get lost in
Yeah.
it. So I think sometimes for me it's the opposite push. I gotta work to like not just be so paint with such a broad brush on everything,
Yeah.
but to really say, oh, what does
Make
this really say?
distinctions.
There's maybe nuances here that I'm gonna try to paint over
Right.
that need to be highlighted. So I think it's probably wise to pay attention to your own makeup when you're doing that.
I've come to value that simplicity though a lot, especially over the last couple of years, because I mean my desire really is to serve people who don't have an academic knowledge of the Bible.
Right.
Some people are just comfortable sort of being academics for academics, and I really want people in our church to understand complex theological ideas, to understand them well, but I want them to remember them and to be able to take them in. And so kind of connected to that, another part that doesn't come natural to me is illustrations. And I, as a listener, I see the value of them. But as a communicator, I always have to work to include that. So I've made adjustments even recently to some of just how I'm patterning my preparation so that I can give more time to that. And I'm convinced it's important.
Yeah. Do you thinking about that? Do you find illustrations that are illustrations about you and your life and personal illustrations to you are a little easier than illustrations that maybe fit the situation more perfectly but are outside of you or something you learned in a book somewhere?
It's always easier to think of illustrations from your own life,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure that's always the most valuable.
Yeah.
You can fall into all sorts of bad patterns of you end up the hero in the story. If you're not very vulnerable, you're not going to tell bad stories about yourself. You can do that. But, I think being keen to kind of where things are happening in your life.
I think people can only take a certain amount of that personal stuff too.
Yeah, and
it becomes narcissism at some point.
It really does. Yeah.
But is that more intuitive to you? Is that easier for you to do than?
It's easier for me to think of something going on
in
my life than to go find stories.
Yeah.
But learning to notice them is really if you're working far enough ahead in your preaching, this is kind of a case for preparing early. Then you kind of see, oh, look at that.
You notice them, I've thought of that too. One of the things that's been a benefit from not preaching as much now that I'm preaching once a month at Pillar is that when I know when I'm preaching, which is almost always, I know a month out, and so as soon as I sort of finish up, I'm thinking, oh, I'm going to be preaching this next month. My my senses are heightened. It's like when you get a new car and you notice that car everywhere. It's the same sort of idea. I notice those things around.
The other thing I do for that though is I listen to a lot of preaching.
Yeah.
I try to listen to 3 or 4 sermons on the text. Now that may be unconventional. I'm not sure what people say to do, but in addition to that, to preparing for the text, I want to listen to a lot of sermons because I just find there's lots of great preaching out there where they've used an illustration. When it sticks, I just say, hey, I was listening to this sermon, and here's a great illustration.
Yeah.
So
great.
Well, kind of in that same vein of thinking about what helps an audience understand simplicity and clarity, what role should humor play in preaching?
Yeah. So I resonate with humor personally. There's a lot of those who teach preachers out there who really tell you to stay away from humor. But man, when I'm listening to somebody preach, I think the way I would say it is those who can take the gospel really seriously but not take themselves very seriously are the ones that most resonate with me.
Yeah.
So I think I'm most inclined to utilize humor as a tool for vulnerability and for sort of lightening the mood a little bit because that works for me. And when I'm in a setting and somebody's teaching me, even if it's powerful teaching, if there's no levity to it at all, if it's like if it's super heavy and dense, then I'm suspicious of it. I think. Because life is so much more worth laughing at in many ways. I mean, and there's a sweet spot where you can be, clear and intense, serious, but still utilize humor as a way of sort of breaking the ice or lightening the mood a little bit. And people that can do that really well, they live on the edge of that fence a little bit, and so at any given moment, you don't know if I'm going to be sort of laughing or crying or feel guilty over my sin or feel I could have this huge dynamic range of emotions in one sermon, and I think that's I think saying no, let's not utilize humor at all is really crazy. Plus, I mean, if Jesus is an example for us, you know, I think there's a good case to be made. I don't know that we have time to go into it right now, but a good case to be made that Jesus utilized, you know, humor or at least irony quite a lot in his Bible teaching or in his teaching.
Do you plan to do it?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. I think on a like scale of 1 to 10, maybe I'm like a 5 funny, just kind of naturally.
Yeah.
But
I'll give you a little higher.
Would you? Okay, good. That's good. Oh, well, I think, you know, as I'm writing a sermon, sometimes funny thoughts come up when you're writing the sermon.
Yeah, right.
And then you can actually like, okay, I would normally be a 5. I would normally say this thing that comes naturally to me. But as I think about it a little bit, I think, oh, if I said it like this, it's even more funny. Or if I, you know, and so you get the chance to kind of craft it. It really is all in the delivery. So that's why sometimes you can, you know, say the same joke in 2 different audiences and it goes over. And it's all about the delivery and the timing and that whole thing. But man, I think humor is this like great resource that we have.
Yeah, both of us have always. I mean, we've talked about Brian Jose.
Yeah.
Just as an example of a guy who we've learned from. And oftentimes in his communication, there is a tone of seriousness.
Yeah. He talks about martyrdom and Christians dying and being persecuted around the world. You know, and I laugh while he's telling me, and he laughs, and we enjoy it. And it's like he can take the most.
Yeah, you felt like he took the
most
seriously.
heavy subject, and he wasn't disrespectful about it.
Yeah.
He was just appropriating it. You know, he's like putting it in the right place, and still allowed it to not be like a. You know, this is probably a bad illustration. I probably leave you thinking this guy's terrible, but man, he just has a way of communicating
no, we've always described it as, you know, he takes the gospel seriously, but he doesn't take himself too seriously, and that really
a lot of it's self-deprecation stuff. Like you know, the best kind of humor is just being able to notice things about yourself, and not in a false humility sort of way, but just in a way that highlights, hey, I'm sinful. We're all sinful. We mess up a lot.
And I think there's something to be said for like almost being in the right mood when you're when you're up there. Like I try not to say too much off the cuff humor, but because it can get you in trouble.
Definitely.
Things you regret.
Oh yeah. Anytime I have gotten myself in trouble or had to apologize publicly or privately to people, it has been because I said something that wasn't written down on the paper. You know? And so I just am at a point right now in my life where I just am really, if I think to go off script, I have this little like heart murmur that says like, don't do it, man, you're gonna have to apologize later. And so, but I sometimes do it anyway, but boy, it's dangerous for me, for me at least. So, okay. All right, Colby. So you know, in different contexts, you're preaching in different settings and with different groups of people. How much does knowing who it is you're preaching to and the audience, how much does that play into, you know, how you feel you've done in preaching and how do you prepare?
Yeah, I think it plays a huge role. This is one of those areas where I think maybe inexperienced communicators don't think about it enough.
Yeah.
You know, thinking about who is it that I'm speaking to. I was helping somebody who's preparing for a wedding this week, and we're talking about the message part of it. And the question I had was, who in the room do you want me to talk to? You know, there's going to be Christians there. There's going to be non-Christians there. They mentioned people who probably assume they're Christians but not. And I just said, well, which one of those groups of people do you specifically want me to talk to? Because other people can listen in and benefit, but you tend to talk to a particular person. And you know, I don't think everyone who communicates is aware that they're talking to a sweet spot. But I know listening to there's a guy, I think. So Cornelius Plantinga has a book called Reading for Preaching, and then Tim Keller said the same thing in some of his stuff. Whoever you talk to, whoever your conversation partners are in life, you tend to be who you preach to. And so if you want to do a good job preaching more broadly, you need to have broader conversation partners, whether that's personal or culturally reading things and just the conversation in your head. But you'll notice if you listen to preachers, you can start to go, I think I know who he is speaking to. That's the person that he thinks really needs to hear his message. And so trying to make yourself more aware of who you're talking to, like who's this message really for, is really helpful. And
how does this message apply to others who may be in the room and calling them out. Keller's great at that. I know a lot of the preachers we really respect do that really well. You know, hey, if you're here today and you're listening to what I'm saying and you're not a Christian, here's how this applies to you, or that sort of thing. Or if you're a lot of times we do this all the time with single people, I think, or you know, we're talking, always assuming we're talking to married people, and then sometimes we just don't hear how a single person hears that. You're particularly good at that, especially around holidays. You always you always will highlight, hey, if you know, if you're experiencing Thanksgiving differently because you've lost a loved one this year, you're like, it's amazing how just a small comment like that can really minister to somebody, draw them into what you're saying. So I think it's a really, really important survey.
Yeah, and so you want to work to try to know some things about that, and as much thinking about, you know, if there's a bunch of people in the room, who's this sweet spot? Like, who is it I really want to affect today?
Yeah.
And who really needs to hear this message? And so partly like pastoring really helps preaching. I feel most comfortable in my own church preaching. I get up in front of a group of people. I'm just not that good at it. I don't know how to even talk sometimes.
Yeah, because we know the same group of people pretty well. We can almost any comment or thought about what we should do in the service can be lobbed out, and we usually have roughly the same response about how the audience might receive that, because we know the audience pretty well. Yeah. So that's a huge piece. Yeah.
So I think thinking about that, and that's partly like what you can adjust in your speaking. You know, like it will change the kind of questions you address. You know, and so I want to assume there's people out there that have questions about the Bible that are trying to understand it, and so I'm going to address those questions as well as I can. Whereas if I was speaking to a group of pastors who probably have thought a lot of those things themselves, I'm going to think about something else about the passage. Probably is going to stick out.
Yeah,
so,
that's good.
Well, you've spent 16 years learning how to preach, something around that. And what has been most surprising to you about learning how to preach?
So I actually gave you this question to ask me because I wanted to be able to say this. So the reason, the thing that's been most surprising to me is the amount of emotion involved in preaching. For me, the range of emotions that happens from the moment I decide on a text to the email correspondence at the end of a sermon that people, get in a car and they ride home with their spouse and they're talking about the sermon and they're either angered by it or helped by it or saddened by it or bothered by one little phrase you used or a particular thing you said. I just did not anticipate, I think before I began to preach regularly, I didn't anticipate that it would require such a dynamic range of my emotion, being involved in it. So I don't know if I'm really explaining that well, but I mean, just
well, I can think of some things sometimes you pick a text. Does fear is the next thing?
Yeah.
You experience that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sure. Yeah. Sure. Everything from the preparation process.
I don't know if I can get a good sermon out of this.
Yeah. Geez.
Oh no, I don't feel confident today.
Yeah, we're mainly exegetical preachers, so we're walking through. We're walking through verse by verse through the text, and you come across a passage sometimes, and you're like, I don't know if I can talk about this, and I don't know. Sometimes it challenges you as a preacher. I consider myself a conservative, faithful to the text kind of guy. But some texts I come up against, they're real. I can't imagine saying this in our day and age. This is going to make me seem like such a bigot, so backwards. And then I'm confronted with, do I believe this gospel that I preach? The preacher is forced to reconcile his own trust and confidence in the scripture all the time when you're doing that. So
about emotions like hypocrisy.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Yeah. I mean, we could tell lots of stories on that one, couldn't we? I mean, how many times? I mean, many times as a preacher, many times as a preacher, you are working on a text that you are not working on in your own life. And so I've got to now square with the fact that I'm going to get in front of a group of people, and I know I'm sort of dishonoring the Lord, disobeying the Lord, or at least at a minimum, kind of not proactively cultivating this area of obedience in my life. And now I've got to get in front of others and like with confidence and passion, plead with them to obey God in this area. And boy, that is really. And I'm doing it with my wife, who is both, in my household, observing me, and sitting on the front row listening to my preaching. And so those things are.
We've recently moved her into childcare.
Yeah, we want to put her in. Just get her out of the room. Yeah, but yeah, it's a tough thing, and then also I think in our environment it helps that we are both preaching regularly, because we can help each other with those things and interact with each other on those things.
I've always taken a lot of comfort in, at the end of the day, we're gospel preachers. So we're preaching a gospel we need.
Yeah.
And even in those moments where I feel woefully short of what I'm going to urge others to do, I'm urging myself, and I'm urging myself out of gospel truths that really helps. I'm not proclaiming myself.
Yeah.
Him we proclaim. It's just like so comforting.
Yeah. And there's actually a way to preach a text that you don't obey and do it faithfully.
Yeah. I think by sort of at least, it doesn't have to be a super vulnerability, but like just an honesty.
Just honesty, yeah. I struggle with this a lot.
Yeah.
I remember one time, this is years ago, but we were preaching a text about stealing. It was just came up about stealing, and I revealed to the congregation that I am tempted often to steal. Were you here when that happened? Do you remember that? I told them that I'm tempted regularly to steal, and that it almost, not every time, but many times when I go into a store, and
lost their lights. Sorry, guys.
Classic. This is a classic, yeah. Tempted to steal, and when even now as an adult, as a preacher for many years, I'll walk into a store and I'll be in the line shopping, and I'll have things, and I'll think I could just stick this in my pocket and I wouldn't have to pay for that. And just to I think people were absolutely shocked that I would have admitted that,
right?
But the truth is, that is honest. That's really what I'm going on. So you may not, and I think because stealing is one of those things that most people don't struggle with, right? And I got to point back to the root of that and say, I discovered that the root of that really is an exaltation of myself, thinking I should deserve this thing. This thing belongs to me. I don't have to pay for it, And anyway, just that whole thing, I just remember that vulnerability, and so many people after that sermon come up to me and say, I cannot believe you said that, but I'm so glad you did. It really made me feel like I could trust you and talk to you about things. And so vulnerability is a good two-way street. It helps people feel like they can talk to you, and you can talk to them. But
generally it raises credibility.
I think
people assume that there's things like that in everyone's life, and it closes that gap a little bit that we don't want to have there between being sort of the sage on the stage.
Yes,
versus
the pulpit and the pew divide. Yes, we want those things to be really close to one another. Colby, people are listening to you preach, and then they're, like I said earlier, they're getting in the car, they're going home, and they're talking about stuff on the way home. What's the thing that, generally speaking, the sort of tombstone thing that you would think people generally, this is true of my preaching, they could say this about me. What's the thing that you hope,
Yeah, it sounds very cliche, but I want people going home thinking what Christ has accomplished for me is great.
Yeah.
Just that they'd just be so taken with thankfulness with what Christ has done through the cross and the hope of the resurrection. So no matter what the applications are, they would feel just a fresh sense of that divine grace and mercy that's experienced through the cross. That Christ is amazing. Christ is the hero. He's who's being celebrated. And so I describe that as sort of a doxological experience in worship. And so you think about preaching, we have a worship service. I feel like sometimes we think of it as we worship and then we listen and learn. This really is the completion of the worship time. We hear the word, it's explained, I'm experiencing conviction, but then Christ is exalted. I'm resting in him, I'm reminding again that he's my position, he's my hope, he's the one who gives me the Spirit, who sanctifies me in this particular area. And so I just want people going home just relishing what they've seen about Jesus. And I think seeing it is the way I would describe it, as a bullseye. I heard about it, I explained it theoretically, I got it. But there's just this sense, and I think many of us have had it, and it doesn't happen every week, where it's like, I saw the work of Jesus, and it was great. Right. And sometimes you see it happen in people's eyes as you're doing that, which is so fulfilling. Yeah, and other times you don't feel that way, but that's the bullseye to me every time. That's good.
We've talked often about, I think both of us think about ourselves and about each other, that we're we're preachers. We can
Yeah.
preach. It's fine. It's not, we're not bad at it. But we're definitely not the rock stars of the preaching world. But we've talked about a lot how consistently being able to hit singles is kind of more important than being able to hit a home run every now and then in terms of preaching. And I think the diet of people being able to come into your congregation, our congregation, and see that every week what I can rely on is it's going to be prepared, it's going to be thoughtful, it's going to be insightful, and I'm going to be helped by the content of this. And so a diet of this is going to be good for me. Although I could probably find better sermons out there, but just this consistent diet, and so I think there's something to be said for not swinging for the fence exactly, but just trying to consistently.
Well, it's a lot of pressure. I mean, it does, and I feel it, and I think anybody who says they don't feel that pressure is probably lying to you. And so that's part of what you deal with internally. But swinging for the fence is not always healthy. I mean, you can miss a lot of important swings. By doing that. And there's a lot of stuff, life is both sort of glorious and mundane. And there's just a lot of mundane things that you have to address and talk about that aren't thrilling, but they're helpful to people, and over time they need to be built into what they're thinking as a church and all that. So, well, I got one more question for you.
Okay.
What do you want people to hear? The people who hear you preach, what do you want them to say on the way home? Very similar question, I guess.
Yours was so spiritual, your answer. I think I don't know if mine's quite so spiritual. I'm challenged. I kind of have a lower bar, I think if people go home and they are thinking about spiritual things in a way that causes them to dig into their Bibles and discuss it with their spouses, and if it's intriguing enough that their kids can understand it enough that they can have a conversation with their kids about it, I feel like those are all really, so I guess the simple answer would be if I can incite further conversation or thought on the matter. So often we're preaching things that are very common to them. We might have people in our church that have been in church for a long time.
Not new to the passage.
Yeah, not new to the passage. So for me, it's a bit of being able to bring something novel from the text, but also, it's a difficult merge to both preach the point of the text every time, but say something fresh and novel about it. So, I feel like if I can send people home thinking about it in a different or unique way, that I've done something really good for them. Some of the best memories I have with my family and my kids are going home, and for me as the preacher saying, what'd you guys think about what I said today? Was it boring? Kids are brutally honest, and was it helpful? What did you remember from the sermon? And just noticing these patterns in the things that they remember and the things that don't stick at all, and they can't remember at all that we said. So, I think I want further conversation to take place.
That's good, and in many ways, I mean, I don't see that as a lower bar. It's like a more humble view of what our role is. There might be a sense in which it's easy to get an exalted idea of how critical the preaching moment is in the life of the church. It is important, but there's also a lot that causes people to grow spiritually. Conversations in the car and daily life and the way that happens in the context.
I remember in my own Christian life, like the guy who was like my pastor when I was a kid, when I became a Christian, he was a good preacher, faithful preacher, but not like, I don't think I remember any one sermon he preached. I actually don't. I know I couldn't tell you one sermon.
Which is a little scary.
It's a little, and I think it's very likely that kids will grow up at Pillar and go.
Absolutely.
And I can't remember anything Pastor Colby said particularly, or Pastor Clint said particularly, but I left there and I knew the word, and and when I was listening to it, it was interesting enough that I could pay attention at the moment, and it gave me something to think about. But I do remember him saying things in his preaching, and it driving me to study more about it and want to know more about it, and giving me a kind of category to place that happened in my life, sin, just those big categories of sin and depravity.
You probably remember a lot about Jesus.
Yeah, a lot about.
I think that's kind of the idea, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it's
like every week we come for an hour and he paints a picture of who this man is, and and I'm getting a clearer picture week after week after week of what Christ is actually like, and what his church is, the role his church is supposed to play, and all that stuff is.
In many ways, there's not a better complement to what the role of a speaker, communicator is.
Yeah, we all say we want Jesus to be exalted, and we want to be kind of tucked in the shadows, and that's what it looks like.
I think with good preaching, that's what happens. People don't remember sermons. I don't remember many sermons, but I remember a lot about Jesus, and somewhere along the way, a lot of the preaching I've listened to has contributed to that view of Christ.
Yeah, and if the truthfulness of the gospel is sort of teetering on you, and you're not sure where it is, like consistent good preaching is kind of always pushing it, this way, so that at some point you just look and you go, I'm really confident that Jesus, who he said he is, that God's word is true, and that confidence came in a series of waves beating up against me, not necessarily a one divine moment, where it was revealed really clearly to me. So that's the way I experienced it. So. Yeah.
Well, I hope it's helpful for you, and we're going to keep working our way to thinking about what is good preaching, teaching, communication, and we hope hearing a little bit about our experience over the last 15 years has helped clarify some of that for you.